All right, well, thank you, Nick, and it's a pleasure to be back. I want to first thank my wife, Julie's here, and I don't, when you're the senator from Alaska, you don't get home that much, so having her in town for a couple weeks has been a real treat for me, and my staff, Jason and Liz, are also here. I want to thank them. You know, I hadn't been to Aspen before in terms of this summer, and Nick mentioned we worked together. I worked for Secretary Rice both at the NSC and when she was Secretary of State as one of her assistant secretaries. So when you get asked by Condoleezza Rice to swing by a conference that she's co-hosting, pretty much always say yes, ma'am, and salute and do that, right? So she's such an incredible, important figure for our country and has done so much. But I got to tell you, I had a wonderful time at the event. A little bit of bonding with Julie and I, we have three teenage daughters. Our youngest, two are in college. Our youngest is in high school, and she actually went with me out to Aspen, and she went to all the events, which was really great, and we actually flew to Denver together and then drove out to Aspen, and she, like millions of high school kids across the country, is a huge fan of Hamilton, the musical. I hadn't really heard much about Hamilton, so we were listening on the whole drive out to Aspen, and then on the drive back, so I started to get into it. But for those of you who were at the Aspen meeting this summer, there was in the meetings, there was all these numerous, some were, I think, stated on purpose, but others were just inadvertent references to Hamilton. Right? So every time that happened, my daughter was sitting in the row there, and she and I would look over and be like. So there's the theme of the whole conference, which was World Turned Upside Down. That was one of the songs in Hamilton. There was another one where we were all in there, H.R. McMaster, Condoleezza Rice, Susan Rice, all these, Steve Hadley, all these big shots, Madeleine Albright, and somebody said, boy, this is really the room where it happens, right? So looked over at my daughter, hey, another one. And then there was even a reference, this is like for the real Hamilton geeks, somebody had mentioned, I think it was about H.R. McMaster, how he was the right-hand man to somebody. And so we were having a lot of fun on Nick, you probably didn't even know that all these references to Hamilton were going on. So thanks again for the invite this summer, and then just to say a few words here. What I wanted to do was try to address up front Nick's kind of opening question, which is, will the U.S. remain the predominant global power despite all the challenges that everybody in the room recognizes? My answer to that is yes, probably, but we need to focus on some key things. And the three key that I wanted to highlight today are returning to robust levels of economic growth, strengthening and deepening our network of alliances that Nick talked about, and then something that I've been focused on and have a little bit of a bird's eye view on right now as a U.S. Senator is a stronger executive legislature cooperation in terms of foreign policy. So let me hit on these each in turn, and then love to take any questions or comments. First, economic growth. So my team has passed out a chart that hopefully you're taking a look at. This was the biggest surprise to me as a U.S. Senator, so I've been in a little under 3 years. And when I came here, I thought the idea of growth, maybe with the exception of national security, that growing our economy, strong traditional levels of robust U.S. growth, was the most important thing Congress should be focused on. Because so many of our challenges get better if we're growing, and so many of our challenges get worse if we're not. And yet, my biggest surprise as a U.S. Senator when I came here 3 years ago was nobody talked about it. Obama administration certainly didn't talk about it. Democrats in the Senate didn't talk about it, but Republicans didn't talk about it either, to be perfectly honest. So in my conference, I used to get up and, hey, how come no one's talking about growth? So I have been going down to the Senate with this chart and bunch of other charts. I feel a little bit like Ross Perot because I pull out these charts on the Senate floor and give this same speech. at least once a quarter, sometimes more often, which is, look at this chart, okay? This explains a lot from my perspective. And this is very bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans. We have focused our country on strong growth. The red line is 3%, which is good. It's not great, but it's okay. It's a good target to shoot for. We haven't hit 3% GDP growth annually in almost 13 years. 13 years. And nobody was talking about it. You know, there's a lot of discussion about making America great, what makes America great. This is what made America great. Almost 4% GDP growth annually, the average with all the recessions since World War II. Since the founding of the Republic, it's about 4%. And yet, we had a decade, starting at the end of the Bush administration, the entire Obama administration, that never hit 3%. And nobody was talking about it. My view is, you want to understand what happened in the 2016 election? Boom. So to me, we have to get back to strong levels of economic growth. Now, I'm a little bit biased, as Nick mentioned. I was Assistant Secretary for the Economic and Energy and Business Affairs Bureau at the State Department under Secretary Rice. But I think this is even more important than military power. Actually, this underpins military power. And yet, we really haven't been focused on it. So, what happened was, if you listen to the narrative, particularly in Washington, people saw this and they're like, well, wait a minute. How do I explain that? And so people started, in my view, making excuses, calling this the new normal. The new normal. 1.5% GDP growth is America hitting on all its economic cylinders. That's a narrative in Washington. To me, it's one of the most dangerous narratives there is. If we think that 1.5 or 2% is it for the country, we're going to have enormous challenges. And we're not going to be positioned for global leadership. My view is different. I don't think that that's the future. I don't believe in the new normal. As a matter of fact, one of the privileges of being in the U.S. Senate, if you go reach out to smart people, like many of the people in this room, who have time on their hands, and you say, hey, I'd like to talk to you about an issue when next time you're in Washington. I've reached out to dozens of people with one question. Is this the future? Do you believe in the new normal of 1.5%? And if not, how do we get back to robust levels of GDP growth that have made this country great and our foreign policy strong? Nobody believes in the new normal, which is why the narrative is so dangerous. So here's the good news on that front. We are finally, I think, starting to focus on this. We are starting to focus on getting back to robust levels of growth. Democrats, Republicans, the White House. I think there are policies that you can undertake. Tax reform. Remember, a lot of the ideas in our current tax reform bill, you don't hear about it in the press. President Obama had these ideas. Chuck Schumer had these ideas. Corporate tax rate at 35%. Nobody thinks that's a good idea in terms of competitiveness of America. Infrastructure, regulatory permitting reform, and the one that I'm very focused on, energy. Energy, energy, energy. The U.S. is on the verge right now of being the world's energy superpower again. Largest producer of oil, bigger than Saudi Arabia, and Russia. Largest producer of natural gas, bigger than Russia. Largest producer of renewables, bigger than anybody. To me, that is an enormous opportunity to grow the economy. And when people talk about instruments of foreign policy, instruments of American power, energy is one that I think we're just scratching the surface on. It's a win-win-win on so many fronts: jobs, energy security, foreign policy, national security, and yes, the environment. The last administration didn't like to talk about hydrocarbons. I was in charge of producing hydrocarbons in Alaska. We have the highest standards in the world on Arctic development in Alaska. So you don't produce there, you drive it out there. What do? You drive it to Russia, or Kazakhstan, or Brazil, or Iran, places that don't have nearly the focus on protecting the environment that we do. So, to me, this issue of strong, robust growth goes to the issue also that Nick mentioned in his opening remarks. This also goes back to the issue of American confidence, which we need to regain. And so many smart foreign policy practitioners recognize that we are best at developing confident, long-term foreign policy when the American people and the country feels confident. And there's nothing like the confidence of a growing economy versus something that's not growing. H.R. McMaster focused on this last week at the Reagan Defense Forum when he talked, as Nick said, Condoleezza Rice talked about this after Aspen. One of my mentors, someone who I think has a lot of respect in this room in terms of foreign policy, Bob Zellick, when he gave his very kind of very well-known responsible stakeholder speech about U.S.-China foreign policy. You look at the end of that speech, he talks about American confidence and having to deal with China from a feeling and position of strength. And to me, it's all about the economy. So that's one area. We have to do better. I think we're getting there. The second is with regard to strengthening our position with our allies. And as all of you know here, as Nick mentioned, over decades, Democrats and Republicans have focused on that. To me, again, even stronger than our military, this is probably the most important strategic advantage we have as a nation. We are an ally-rich nation, and most of our adversaries or potential adversaries are ally-poor. There's not many countries looking to join the Iran team or the North Korea team or even the Russia or China team. But in my experience, there's still countries who really want to be part of the U.S. alliance system. So we need to deepen our current alliances and expand them. So how are we doing on that? Well, I think it's a mixed assessment. Last year, I thought we hit a low point, to such a degree that I went on the Senate floor and gave a couple speeches on, hey, the importance of our alliances. Why was it a low point? Well, you had, at the time, presidential candidate Donald Trump talking about NATO being obsolete, talking about, questioning Korea, Japan alliances as a candidate. The other thing, though, that was going on that didn't get nearly as much press, some of you probably read it, there was a very big article in The Atlantic by Jeffrey Goldberg about the Obama doctrine. Now, had you read that, it made what Donald Trump was saying on the campaign trail pale in comparison to how dismissive President Obama was of almost all our allies. Go reread that article. Pretty remarkable that a sitting president was smacking pretty much everybody but Angela Merkel in an article that he knew that millions of people would read. So to me, that's what prompted a number of senators to come and say, whoa, wait a minute. Democrat, President Obama, possibly new president, President Trump, because it's during the election. You guys need to remember, our allies are critically important to us. So, in terms of my assessment on this, how are we doing? Well, I think, again, going back to this issue of strong economic growth, more energy, that kind of power from the United States binds us closer to our allies. As all of you know, focus on the Asia-Pacific. A strong U.S. economy, in many ways, is much more important than our military presence out there versus China's strong economy. I think if we can start turning that around, start using new instruments of power like energy, that can help us with our allies. In Asia, I think we're starting to do well. The president has put together a team, Secretary Mattis, Secretary Tillerson, McMaster, Dunford, the vice president, who have spent a lot of time in Asia already. You may have seen on the last trip, launching the Quad consultations between the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, to me was a very smart strategic move that hopefully we can deepen. I even think we need to look at perhaps a much stronger trilateral security arrangement between Korea, Japan, and the United States, which has a lot of potential. So in that area, and I also think despite some news last week in the Middle East with regard to the opportunities with our alliances, we have an opportunity with regard to particularly our traditional Gulf Arab allies and Israel of working much, much more closely together because we all see and view our common interests, particularly with regard to pushing back against the hegemonic aspirations and terrorist activities of Iran. So these are areas where I think, in terms of allies, there's some positive things happening. The negatives, Europe. There continues to be a lot of skepticism of this administration, particularly I think a lot of it is driven by what happened with regard to the Paris Climate Accords and the Iran nuclear deal. And I'll touch on that in a minute, but also strategic communications. Binding our allies means kind of disciplined strategic comms, and I think foreign policy by tweet is by definition not strategic, and we need to do a better job on that. Congress can obviously play a really important role in all of this, which brings me to my third and final point. In terms of setting the United States for continued global leadership, I think we have to do a better job of getting back to the difficult work, because it's difficult, of better executive, legislative cooperation and working together in the area of foreign policy and national security. You look at history, all of you know, because you're all experts on it, the United States is strongest in the world when the executive branch and the Congress are working together, are speaking with one voice. It's not easy. Often it's hard. I think people look back on history and say, oh, that was easy, getting the NATO alliance through the Senate. No, it wasn't. But it's hard work. But what is it? It's durable. It's durable. So in my short time, 3 years in the Senate, I've seen where it's worked, where it hasn't. Steve's going to talk about trade. One of the things that we worked on when the Republicans retook power in the Senate after the 2014 election, which is the class I came in with, is we immediately started working with the Obama administration on trade promotion authority. The president couldn't get it when his own party was in power. When the Republicans came back, took the Senate, that's when the discussions happened. I worked closely with the Secretary of the Treasury, USTR, Secretary of Commerce of the Obama administration to make sure we got TPA passed. Passed the Senate with 60 votes, not one vote to spare. But we did that. And I think it's an opportunity now that we have that. That's in the law. But with regard to the Iranian nuclear deal, with regard to the Paris Climate Accords, I can tell you, at least from my experience and my class of senators, there was zero engagement from the White House. Zero. No one ever came over and said, Senator, this is what we're trying to do. This is why this is good for America. We're going to bring this to the Senate. To the contrary, they did everything they could to avoid Senate ratification of these very important agreements. So I think it's a little bit difficult to complain that a president who actually campaigned against these agreements because they weren't ratified by the Senate, which would have taken a lot of hard work, and then when he came in and did it, is now being criticized. My view is some of the criticism should have been on the previous administration that never came to the Senate at all and said, this Iran nuclear deal is really important. Here's why you should ratify it, and here's how we're going to work hard to make sure you understand it and can do it. When you don't do that, you get dramatic swings in foreign policy. So that kind of work is hard. But this was even predicted by our founding fathers. If you look at the Federalist Papers, number 63 by James Madison, he lays out how critical a role the U.S. Senate plays with regard to, particularly given its long tenure, 6 years, its staggered elections, with regard to our relations and keeping a steady foreign policy. When you avoid that, and both parties are guilty of doing it, you have these swings. And so my view is we need to get back to doing that. But there's good news on that front. The good news is there's a lot more bipartisanship, from my perspective, that goes on in the Congress and in the Senate than you read about. Now, I'm not one who loves to get up and bash the media, but I would say in this area, the media loves to have stories about conflict, about how the partisanship in the Senate. I was reading a couple years ago a very smart observer of the American foreign policy scene in the Financial Times. He wrote a piece that essentially said the partisanship in the Senate hasn't been so high since the Civil War. Well, no offense to this writer, but that's a ridiculous statement. And there's a lot more that goes on. It just doesn't get reported. Let me give you some examples, big and small. The National Defense Authorization Act. That is a very serious, important piece of legislation. I sit on the Armed Services Committee. This year's NDAA dramatically pluses up the military. Dramatically pluses up the military. It passed out of committee unanimously. Unanimously. Did you read that in the paper? You didn't. I didn't. And yet, when it went to conference with the House, came back to the Senate for a vote, it passed by unanimous consent. That means 100 U.S. senators voted for the NDAA, which the President's going to sign this week. That's very significant. That's about as bipartisan as it gets. And you didn't read about it, and that's a really important bill for the country, for our national security. One that I talked about at Aspen, Joe Kennedy and I had the opportunity to sit on a panel when we were there, talking about bipartisanship or the domestic home front. He and I have a bill. It's already passed the Senate. He's working hard to get it passed in the House on a topic that all of a sudden is very, very timely, to bring much more resources to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, essentially attorneys, to represent mostly women who, as you're seeing across different parts of American society, have been abused. Okay? That's not a huge bill, but I think it's a really important bill. And Joe's the lead guy in the House. I'm the lead guy in the Senate. It's already passed the Senate. And then just on the more personal front, tomorrow night, Julie and I are going to go have dinner with one of my colleagues who I consider a good friend in the Senate, Sheldon Whitehouse. Okay, now if you know Sheldon Whitehouse's politics and Dan Sullivan's politics, you might be like, whoa, I can't believe these guys are going to dinner. But that happens. And as a matter of fact, Sheldon Whitehouse and I have a bill that's already passed the Senate called the Save Our Seas Act. It's about cleaning up the ocean debris. Trying to get it passed in the House. So there's a lot more that goes on. I just think that in terms of foreign policy and national security, to position ourselves from a strong perspective in the future, we need to have that kind of cooperation in the Congress. So, strong growth, imperative. Strengthening, deepening our alliances, imperative. And better cooperation on the foreign policy, national security issues between the Congress and the executive branch, to me, do set us up for the next several decades of leading the world during challenging times. Thank you very much, Nick.
The senator is going to take your questions. Just why don't you just let me know who would like to ask the first question. I now teach college. I can call on people. Ambassador Negroponte. Welcome, sir.
Good morning, Ambassador.
I know you are on a caucus for the Foreign Service.
Yes.
And I was wondering, given that has been in the news a bit lately, whether you might want to comment on your views and the work of your caucus. Thank you.
Sure. Well, this is so it's an honor even to be asked a question by one of the deans of the Foreign Service and great leaders of American diplomacy over the last generation, John Negroponte, who I also happen to have the opportunity to serve with. But, you know, one of the things, when I got to the Senate, there's caucuses, right, that kind of show demonstration of support in the Senate. And there's a caucus on a lot of different issues. But where the caucuses, in my view, are very strong, there's an Army caucus, a Marine Corps caucus, a Navy caucus, Air Force, Coast Guard, right? So really strong constituencies in the Congress for these very important aspects of American government. And for those of you who don't believe that, Julie and I just spent the Saturday in Philadelphia at the Army-Navy game, and trust me, there's a lot of strong support for our troops and the wonderful young men and women who go to those world-class institutions. But what was interesting to me, and for those of you who have served in the Foreign Service, there was not any kind of caucus, any kind of, established group that's supporting our career Foreign Service officers. And as somebody who actually led a group of them, as the EB Assistant Secretary, you're kind of the father of all the econ-coned Foreign Service officers, I got to know what a great group of professionals our Foreign Service officers are, who, in many ways like the military, deploy overseas, dangerous places. Some have been killed in action. Families sacrifice and risk. And so, and to be honest, as a Republican, I thought some of the, there was kind of a, I'm trying to use a diplomatic term here, a sense that a lot of the Foreign Service is kind of left-leaning, but my experience was very professional. They do great work. So I went to Senator Chris Van Hollen, whose father was very well known in the Foreign Service, and said, hey, we should get a Foreign Service Officers Caucus going in the Senate to support the men and women in the Foreign Service. And oh, by the way, those of you know who have served at the State Department or part of the Foreign Service, there's also a culture there that they really hate coming up to the Hill, I think, most of them. So this was a little bit more of a, hey, it won't be the TV cameras going, it's just a caucus to kind of come and meet and let us try to show our support for you. So we launched that about 6 months ago. As a matter of fact, the Deputy Secretary of State is coming to our caucus this Wednesday on the Senate side to meet with senators who just want to show their support, have questions, have concerns. But I think making sure that our Foreign Service officers know that they have strong support in the Congress and a constituency that supports them is really important. And it gets to this issue of executive legislative cooperation, because those are the kind of things that breed that kind of cooperation. When we first launched the caucus 6 months ago, we had on the Republican side senators like Orrin Hatch, Jim Risch, really strong, very well respected. Chris Murphy on the Democratic side, Catherine Cortez Masto, Nevada senator. So we had a good group, 10 senators already, and hopefully we're going to grow that, but I think it's an important element of that strengthening executive legislative cooperation and making sure we on the Senate understand the hard work, the sacrifice that our Foreign Service officers do for our country every day.
Senator, can I just follow up? Ambassador Negroponte and I both served in the Career Foreign Service. The administration's proposal is a 31% budget reduction for state to take the officer corps down by 8%. It's no secret morale is very low, and there's a dismantling of the Foreign Service. At least that's what I think.
Yeah.
Can the Congress intervene to defend the Foreign Service?
Well, look, we're trying. I have concerns too, and some of it is what you're reading in the paper, and you got to get to the truth. Let me give you an example. There was an article recently that said the applications for the Foreign Service are down by 50%. Now, I don't know the truth of that. It was in a newspaper. I'm assuming they're correctly reporting. But to me, that should be a cause for enormous concern. Think about it. If the Marine Corps' recruiting was down by 50%, guarantee you we'd be having hearings on the Armed Services Committee saying, hey, what's happening in the Marine Corps? So, and you know, Nick, your question on the budget, I don't think that dramatic a cut by a third of the Foreign Service or our related aid programs are going to see that kind of support in the appropriations process in the Congress. But again, part of this goes to a broader issue of getting the Congress to understand, to know the great work that the men and women and their expertise in the Foreign Service have. And I think everybody, when you do a CODEL, you go overseas, people see it. But to do it on a regular basis is what we're trying to do in the Senate.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Congresswoman Harman, member of our group, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. Dan, you're a great credit to the Senate. It's really
thanks.
wonderful to hear you
Thank you.
on many topics, including the Arctic, which we didn't get to today. My question is about Congress's role in authorizing the use of military force, something Nick knows I'm passionate about. I was there in 2001 when we passed, with all but one vote, the authorization to use military force against those who attacked us on 9/11. That tired document is still the basis for most of the U.S. activity in the Middle East and elsewhere. At least 7 wars have been justified under that.
Yeah.
The State Department and the Defense Department recently testified that they don't need more authority. They testified before John McCain's committee. Do you think that's true, or do you think, as I do, that there ought to be a robust debate in the Senate and the House about the use of military force, the strategy behind it, so that the American people can have a chance to consider and buy into the military activities we have underway?
Yeah, I'll kind of address that in 2 parts. There was a debate recently. Rand Paul had an amendment to, now it wasn't a multi-day debate, but I believe it was part of when we were marking up the NDAA on the Senate floor. And his amendment essentially said what you were saying, hey, we've authorized the 2001 authorization has been used in a whole host of other ways. We need to either reauthorize it or cut it off. That was what his amendment essentially did. I have a lot of respect for Rand Paul on a whole host of issues. I voted against that, but we did debate it, came to the floor. The main reason I voted against that was that, I'll just give you an example. Alaska has a group of incredible young men and women going off. They're over there right now. It's the 425, the 4th Brigade of the 25th Infantry. It's based at J-Bear in Anchorage, and they're in Afghanistan right now. And I spoke at their deployment ceremony. And the one thing I said to these guys and women before they left is, look, I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you are supported back at home. Matter of fact, this weekend I'm trying to go visit them in Afghanistan, and my wife is hosting a party back in Anchorage for the spouses of the deployed soldiers. So we mean that seriously. And I thought having a debate on this where we might cut off the authorization of their mission, mid-mission, was not how we should be addressing this. So there's elements of, it's an important topic, but there's also realities on the ground. We have soldiers and Marines and many others on the ground now, and the last thing I think we should be doing is having some kind of debate where we're saying we're not sure that you're authorized to do what you're doing right now as you risk your lives. And that was a commitment I made directly to these soldiers at their deployment ceremony, so that's why I voted no. Now, on a in many ways, a related topic, North Korea. I've been very involved in the Senate, but also with the administration, publicly, but also privately, because I have a lot of respect. I think the President's put together a very strong national security team on North Korea. I think what they've been trying to do now, and obviously it's a tough issue, very tough. It's bedeviled numerous administrations. I think, but this administration has really been faced with a stark challenge because it's very likely Kim Jong-un is going to have a capability for an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile that can't just range Alaska. We've been on the front lines for years, but Chicago or New York. And, so I think their diplomacy right now has, with the sanctions, with the UN Security Council resolutions, has been very strong. One element that I've been trying to lead on, and we've made a lot of progress in the Congress with the President and his team, of our strategy with regard to North Korea we need a much more robust missile defense system. And by the way, that's another good news story. I had a bill that's now part of the NDAA, very bipartisan, 28 senators, Democrats, Republicans, supporting a really strong missile defense system for America. That's never happened before. Missile defense has always been partisan. Now it's bipartisan. So that's important, a key element of our strategy. And I also support, Secretary Mattis, H.R. McMaster talk about it, the development of credible military options. As everybody here knows, when you have serious credible military options, it actually makes your diplomacy more effective. But what I've said publicly and privately to them, if part of your credible military options is a preventative or preemptive ground war on the Korean Peninsula launched by the United States, they need the authorization from Congress to do that. So, as a matter of fact, a couple senators, prominent senators, right now we are working on not the resolution for that, but a Senate resolution that says, hey, we're supportive of what they're doing, but if they move forward, again, preemptive, preventative, kind of like the Gulf War in 1990 or 2003, that is the Article I power of Congress. And I don't think there shouldn't be any debate about it. I've been asking during confirmation hearings of members of the administration going into the Department of Defense, I've probably asked this question a dozen times. Do you believe you need to come to the Congress to get authorization to do this? Pretty much all of them, including the reauthorization or the reconfirmation of General Dunford at his reconfirmation hearing just a couple of weeks ago, they've all said yes. So to me, that's where I think the AUMF issue is going to come to a head. Not all my Senate colleagues agree with me, by the way, on this. And I respect their views, but I just think that they haven't read the Constitution or the Federalist Papers in a while. So it's a great question, and I think in terms of North Korea, it's one I'm looking at from one angle versus the Afghanistan deployments and other kind of war on terror authorizations, which, again, still very valid. I just think they're some ways different from a kind of contextual standpoint.
Senator, I know you're busy, but I think we have to ask a follow-up question. This is such an important issue, North Korea. So, twofold question. Number one, on the merits of the issue, it seems that Secretary Tillerson and Secretary Mattis would like to move to maintain deterrence over North Korea, but possibly move, if it's can happen, to some kind of diplomatic negotiations that would involve the North Koreans, that would stop their program. But then there are other people in the administration who believe that we ought to think seriously about preemptive action. What do you think is the right step for the United States, question one? And question two, on your point about congressional authorization, where is the Republican Party leadership in the Senate on that, and what kind of signals are you getting from the White House, from President Trump, from the National Security Advisor?
Well, look, Nick, I think they're both good questions, but as I mentioned, I think they're actually interrelated. I think that your diplomacy, as I mentioned, is much more effective if your adversaries believe that it's a continuum and that credible military options are part of that continuum. If you go in, and this is, again, I'm not, there was a lot of things where I was supportive of the last administration's foreign policy on, but I do believe by the end of the Obama administration, nobody, because of a whole series of events like Syria and other things, Russia, none of our potential adversaries in the world thought that that administration had the will or desire to possibly use military force. And I think it made their diplomacy a lot more ineffective. So having credible military options on the table, I think is important, particularly given this regime and how unstable and unpredictable they are. I think the focus of our diplomacy is not necessarily negotiations with North Korea, who decade after decade proves to be a very unreliable partner to negotiate with. I don't think they've ever kept one end of any bargain that they've agreed to with the United States, ever, and I don't think that's going to change. You can't trust them. You can't trust the Iranians, similarly. The key should be with regard to China. That's where our focus with regard to diplomacy, both public and I also hope, certainly privately, discussions with regard to China on how to solve this problem. But I think making it all about North Korea, U.S. negotiations, in some ways, I wouldn't say that's a waste of time, but that's a sideshow because they can't be trusted. They've never shown that they can be trusted. But China has, I think, hopefully, converging interests with us on resolving this. And they have the power and the ability to do it. And so that's where I think our focus with regard to diplomacy. With regard to your question on the AUMF on the Republican side, like I said, I've voiced this very publicly in confirmation hearings on the Armed Services Committee. Most of the senior administration officials I've asked the question of believe, and have stated it, that they believe a preemptive or preventative ground war on the Korean Peninsula needs the authorization of Congress. Is the Republican Senate completely unified on that view? No, it's not. There's some very prominent senators who I'm good friends with, have the utmost respect for, who actually don't necessarily believe that Article 1 requires the administration to come get the authority from us. I just happen to think they're wrong. And I think that you'll see, hopefully soon, we'll have a resolution out with some, I think, very well-known senators that say we're being supportive. We're not trying to do this aggressively. There's some senators on the Democratic Party who, on the Democratic side, who are kind of saying, oh, it's all a disaster. No, we're trying to be supportive. I actually think an AUMF, if they can get it, brings more credibility to the diplomacy. But that would be a very serious debate in Congress. And I think if it comes to that, and we're not calling for it right now, but if it comes to that, we should have it.
Please join me in thanking Senator Dan Sullivan.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. Of course. My pleasure. Yeah, it was great to be here.